Hey there, art nerds. You asked for it. Today, we're taking a look at the O.Win watercolor set. We have reviewed a lot of Shanghai Owin materials here in the past, and this one promises to be just a little bit different. So I am really excited to unbox it and swatch it with you guys today. There, art nerds, you asked for it and I am happy to comply. Today we're taking a look at the O.Win watercolor set. This set was purchased on AliExpress and it's part of my student grade showdown where I dig around to find the best student grade watercolors for the price. So let's find out together whether this set stands up to the student grade challenge. This cute little watercolor set was purchased on AliExpress for around $13.34. I may have paid more, I may have paid less. I bought this a while back using funds from my Patreon. So thank you guys so much. Your support makes reviews like this one possible and I really appreciate it. This is a 24 watercolor cake set. Usually we're used to seeing half pans. These might be cakes. They promise bright colors, high transparency, and easy to capture, which who knows what that means. So they are for watercolor wash drawings, hand account, and illustrations. On the back, it says O.Win watercolor cakes. This is the same symbol as the Aowen watercolors, and I believe these are all manufactured by the Paul Rubens parent company. As you guys can see, it says Shanghai Owin Art Materials Co. Limited. So that would put this set in kind of the same category as our Meiliang pigments and the other Aowen set. So later on in today's unbox and swatch, we're going to talk about those and kind of compare it to other comparable student grade sets. I appreciate that on the back it actually tells us what colors are in this set. That makes it easy for me. I don't have to pull out Google Translate. This is a shrink wrapped box. Inside the box there is a a metallic cardboard belly band, and then there's a plastic box inside. And I was going to use my scissors to open it. There's a little hole right there. And since it was from AliExpress, it did take a few weeks to arrive, and it did come in a bubble wrap mailer. So I was a little bit surprised when I opened this. First of all, this plastic case is kind of nicer than I expected. There's some plastic embossing that says Owen on the front. It doesn't snap shut particularly well, so if you're going to travel with this, you may want to use a rubber band to hold it shut. It does have a plastic thumb ring on the back for plein air painting. It's fairly lightweight. Inside we have 3 large mixing wells. We have the O.Win informational booklet, which I've covered the other times I've talked about Aowen products, so we're not going to Google Translate it here. It shows some basic watercolor techniques. It's got their QR codes. I think those lead to their WhatsApp. And then what's in here is pretty similar to what's included in the Paul Rubens part, at least this. It's all manufactured by Shanghai Owin Painting Materials Co. Limited. Sometimes you'll see it spelled O-W-I-N as well. And then on this side, they have the colors in the 24-piece set and the 18-piece set, as well as the light fast information. So one of the things I really like about Paul Rubens / Meiliang / Owin is that for student grade watercolors, they're really pretty dang decent and the price is very fair. And B, they're fairly transparent about their color information. In this instance, they're not providing pigment info. That's pretty par for the course for the Meiliang and the other Owin set. It really wouldn't surprise me if this set and the Aowen set that I reviewed earlier are pretty similar. This kind of also reminds me of the Paul Rubens pocket palette, where we had a plastic cover to kind of keep our semi-moist cakes, because these do seem to be semi-moist, sort of like Yarka or even Crayola. Not saying these are the same quality as Crayola, just saying these are similar in that regard to Crayola, where they're semi-moist. So I would think over time and over use, these would crack as they start to dry out. We also have there is a plastic riser in here. It seems to be glued in. I can't remove it. so that doesn't really seem to be going anywhere. And we also have a water brush. I'm not the biggest fan of water brushes personally. I find most of the cheap ones all tend to be the same, and I have a problem where they tend to leak. So for today's review, I'm not even going to look at the water brush. I wouldn't even be using the water brush. We do have a space in here that does seem like it's a little short for a short watercolor handled brush, not the long handled. This is like desk size, but you could probably fit some folding or some travel watercolor brushes in here, or you could trim the handle if you want to carry your brushes in your palette. It's kind of up to you. I choose not to, generally because I find that they just all stay wet and then I have mold problems. Also, I do not know if my mic is picking this up. If you hear weird grinding noises, my husband and I live in Southeast Louisiana. We're having a generator installed right before hurricane season, so that's what's going on. We're gonna be just fine this hurricane season. No more Idas for us. So I don't know if you guys can see it, but the plastic wrap, it's an adhesive plastic wrap. It's a clear plastic wrap. It has the color numbers. I believe it probably has the color names in Chinese, and then it has the names in English in Chinese. And this is actually a pretty accessible to English speaker, non-fluent in Chinese person packaging, which is nice. This might be, not all of it is, but this might be intended for an international release. So I'm actually kind of excited about this. I was worried this would be exactly like the Aowen and the Meiliang pigments that we've talked about, which would be boring, but it's not. It's kind of its own unique thing. It did not come with a swatch card, which is kind of unusual for Meiliang / Aowen / Paul Rubens products, but fear not, I've got stuff that we can swatch on. It's not a big deal that this set didn't come with a swatch card because we can create our own, and typically I prefer to make my own swatch maps anyway because they just take up less space. So for today's unbox and swatch, I'm going to be using the same things I use every day, Pinky. We're going to be swatching on the Blick Studio cold pressed cotton rag watercolor blocks. So this is as fair as we can get for swatching, and this is what I swatch all of my student grade Showdown on. And I was on Dick Blick the other day, and this has gotten really expensive. So I want to take another minute to thank my patrons, because not only do their funds go towards buying the supplies that I review on the channel, but they also go towards the consumables that get consumed in these reviews. So if it weren't for their help and support, I would not be able to afford to do this. So I am super appreciative. If you'd like to join their much hallowed ranks, get early access to reviews and tutorials like what we're doing today, you can join me at patreon.com/natosoup. So I am going to use a Copic marker, and this is going to help us do our opacity testing. And we only have 24 colors, so this should be pretty straightforward. It's going to be 12 on each line. And what we're going to be looking for is we're going to be looking at opacity. We want some colors to be more opaque than others. That's just the nature of pigments. We're also looking at saturation, how the colors wash out. They shouldn't just fade to nothing when we add water, like we've seen with some of the dye-based watercolors I've reviewed. We're going to be looking at mass tone. After it's had a chance to dry fully, we're also going to be looking at liftability. Some colors should be more lifting than others. We're going to be looking at how much the colors muddy the water, because that could be a sign of optical brighteners, which, while they are not the worst thing in the world, they are a red flag that they're using cheaper materials to make these. But considering this set was $13.34 on AliExpress and has 3 out of 5 stars, we're probably going to see some optical brighteners. It's probably good to adjust our expectations. Now, something I have noticed is that in the West, in the US, things that are aimed at children are often marketed as student grade, and things that are marketed as student grade in other countries are often sold as professional grade here. So we might be looking at a children's grade, a good a good children's grade watercolor set. So that's definitely something for us to keep in mind, but I'm still going to be looking for granulation. I'm going to be looking at opacity. I'm going to be looking at whether or not the colors turn to nothing when we add water. We're going to be looking at color mixing, which I'll do a little bit later on. We're going to do our wet into wet test. So I'm going to treat these the way I would treat any other student grade watercolors, because I have found that there are some children's grade watercolors, like the Yarka children's grade watercolors, that make for a great, affordable, and accessible student grade watercolor that will still allow you to do many of the techniques you can do for watercolor painting without breaking your budget. So even if these do turn out to be children's grade, and I should point out that the listing doesn't say anything about them being children's grade, I've just got starting to get a bit of a hunch here, but the colors are bright, brilliant, and beautiful, and they do remind me of the Paul Rubens pocket set. So just because they're in this format doesn't really mean a whole lot. They look like they are actually not sticky at all. They're kind of Gensai style, and inside this plastic liner, which is sticky from the adhesive wrapper here, if this stickiness bothers you, and it might bother me, you can use a little bit of rubbing alcohol to try to remove it. But it does seem like these are in little bitty, like almost like makeup pans inside this palette. So you probably can refill them if you're very careful, but if you wanted to replace them entirely, you'd have to remove this plastic shell and you'd have to pry this out. It does move a little, but you'd have to like use a pry tool to pry it out, and I just don't care that much. So I'm not going to pre-activate these. Maybe I will. Maybe I will with a spritz of water. With Paul Rubens, it's iffy. Sometimes it benefits from pre-activation. Sometimes pre-activating it just makes it way too soupy and gloopy. So to pre-activate, we're just going to spritz it with some water. Give it a second to soak up that water, and then we can get to swatching. So on some of the colors, but not even most of the colors, really just one or two, we're starting to see areas where they lighten up, where the water droplets have hit. That's often a sign that optical brighteners have been included, but I'm really not seeing it as much as I've seen on some of the other watercolors we've looked at in the student grade Showdown. So that actually bodes quite well for these. So I am looking at opacity, mass tone, how they wash out, granulation, liftability, and activation. And the colors in this set are white, lemon yellow, light yellow, dark yellow, yellow orange, vermilion red, crimson, rose red, red purple, reddish violet, ultramarine, phthalo blue, Prussian blue, yellow green, and grass green, phthalo green, emerald, olive green, yellowish brown, earthy red, ochre, burnt umber, and black. And I found that these pollute the water about what you would expect for student grade watercolors. That's why I wave the cup of water beneath the camera so you guys can see. And that's kind of a tip off as to whether or not these have a lot of extenders or optical brighteners, how quickly they pollute the water. But I did find that they managed to keep their saturation decently well when we added water, unlike some of the other sets we reviewed here on the channel. See me art, Xylee W, I'm looking at you. And they were quick to activate and fairly easy to use. There is some granulation and there's decent saturation, but not quite as much as I expected. And they're very similar to the Aowen and the Meiliang palettes, which is not a surprise. They come from the same parent company. While I wait for these swatches to finish drying, I'm gonna just move it over a bit so that you guys can see, and we'll do some color mixing. So if you're new here and you're not exactly familiar with what I mean by color mixing, this is a good test to kind of give us an idea of how well these will handle in kind of real world watercolor situations. So we're going to be doing two kinds of color mixing. We're going to be doing atomic, where we take two colors and physically mix them together. And we're going to be doing optical, where we put one layer of color down, let it dry fully, and then put another layer of color down. And generally I do this using primary colors with a few kind of common mixes in there like Payne's gray, just to kind of test it out. So we're going to be mixing oranges, greens, and purples using reds, blues, and yellows. So for color mixing, I'm going to start by applying my first layer of colors, my cool yellow, my warm yellow, my cool red, my warm red, my cool blue, my warm blue in like the first layer of the grid for our optical mixing. And then I'm going to start with our actual physical manual atomic mixing. These were fairly easy to mix and I was able to get good secondary colors using atomic mixing. If I'd been more particular about picking a rose red as my cool red, the purples could have been even better. It is easy to pollute the colors and the colors do get used up fast. I used the provided mixing surface to mix my colors because hey, that's what it's there for. For optical mixing, I may not have let my first layer dry long enough because there was a lot of reactivation and pollution. So this is going to be something I'm going to have to keep an eye out for in the future. I used a wet paper towel to wipe down my mixing surface, and while I was able to easily clean up most of the paint, it does stain really easily, which is really common for these sort of painted plastic surfaces. If you're hoping to get it back to enamel or pristine white, that's probably not going to happen. We've got one more test left to do. That's going to be the wet into wet test. But before we dive into that, I do want to do the lift test where we test how liftable these are. And I kind of want to talk to you guys about these paints. So the colors inside are bright, vibrant, and fairly saturated. They really remind me of the other Shanghai Owin products like the Meiliang and the Aowen, A-O-W-E-N paints. The only difference is these are more like a Gensai style paint where you not only get the larger half pans or the larger pans where it's easier to get bigger brushes in, but they're very quick to activate to the point where pre-activating them can turn them to soup. So you may want to go in without a whole lot of water. You may not want to spritz them first. And you also probably don't want to allow water to pool on them because then it really globs up on the brush and color control becomes difficult and you end up wasting a lot of paint. A lot of paint ends up in your paint cup. I wouldn't say these are full of optical brighteners, at least no more than the other Shanghai Owin products that I've reviewed. So really this is pretty similar, just a different format. They may have used different pigments, but they're not really talking about what pigments they're using. I noticed that the colors activate quickly. There's decent saturation, but maybe not as much as I wanted. And that kind of amends as I do the color mixing. There's some granulation, which is good. They don't totally disappear when I add water, unlike a lot of the dye-based cheap watercolors I reviewed. And they're very similar to the Aowen and the Meiliang, which I'll pull out and show you guys in a little bit. In terms of color mixing, these have a good selection of colors in the set, so they're good mixing yellows, reds, blues, and some nice purples. The neutrals are a little subdued, but they're not too bad. I've definitely seen worse in other sets. These, again, don't really need pre-activation as the water sits on them and they get soupy. I'm not really sure what the binder is, but I doubt it's honey. Honey would do that, but it might be glycerin. And like I said earlier, they're kind of similar to Gensai style watercolors, so they could be using an animal hide glue. If you guys actually know, please let me know down in the comments below, as well as your source if you've got one. They're not as opaque as Gensai style watercolors, but if you enjoy Gensai style watercolor with quick activation, lots of saturation, and large open pans, this set hits a lot of those notes. So this could be good for origami painting, it could be good for field painting, it could be good for people who want more immediate watercolor. They don't want to have to wait for the watercolor to activate and be ready. These seem to be more accessible. So for atomic mixing, it's fairly easy to get good secondary colors using atomic mixing, and I did use the mixing surfaces up here at the top. This is just plastic that's been coated, by the way. If I'd been more particular about picking, say, a rose red, said, the purples could have been even better. It's very easy to pollute these colors, and colors get used up fast, so generally I would recommend cleaning your brushes a little bit more before you grab between colors, because even just cleaning the pans to remove that polluted color, you end up wasting a lot of paint because these are very soft paints. Now for optical, I may not have allowed these to dry long enough because there was a lot of reactivation and pollution. If these were actually Gansai style paints, once the paints had actually dried to the paper, there would not be any lifting. And that's because of the animal hide glues used. So I may not have let them dry long enough. That's definitely an area of concern and something I want to keep an eye out for. But speaking of lifting, now we're going to do our lift test. I am going to use a synthetic flat watercolor brush. So I've got a cotton brush here, as well as a cup of clean water and a clean paper towel. Now what we're looking for is varying degrees of liftability. Some colors should naturally be more lifting than others. Surprisingly, all of these colors lift very little. I attribute this more to the mystery binder than to the pigments used. Kind of surprisingly, kind of not. These all lift very little. I say kind of surprisingly because with some of the Paul Rubens products and the Meiliang, some of those are a little more lifting. You see a little bit more movement, but I have a feeling this non-liftability has a lot to do with the binder. And that's one of the problems with buying art supplies out of context from other countries is this might be intended as kind of a Gansai style palette, or it might be intended as a children's palette. But if it was a children's palette and it was using more washable binders, then it would be super lifting. So I'm kind of leaning away from that. But with that context kind of stripped away, all we can do is kind of guess. And this was all we can do is guess. And this was really prevalent when Gansai style watercolors first started seeing American shores. A lot of people didn't really know what to make of them because while you can do a lot of techniques that are common in more, say, Western styles of watercolor, they have some interesting limitations that led some people to judge them kind of unfairly because they weren't being judged on the basis for which they're designed and intended. They were being judged on a completely different basis. And while they do pretty well on that basis, of course, there's going to be some areas where they fall short. So I'm wondering if this isn't that sort of situation. The price point, though, is really low for the amount of color you get. So the liftability so far is the most glaring problem, and that when you layer colors, they do reactivate, which is concerning, but you can't really pick up the colors once they seem to have dried. So, you know, I think for the price point, one could definitely overlook that if that's the only problem that really starts to rear its head. So next, we're going to do the wet into wet test, and hopefully that's going to tell us a lot about the inclusion of optical brighteners, because often with these kind of paints, you'll get these like white halos that come out with the wet into wet test. So that's something to keep an eye out for. We're also going to see if they get kind of gluey and refuse to move, or if the pigments disperse nicely. Generally with Shanghai Owin products and Paul Rubens products, you're going to see really nice color dispersal in water. So I'm going to be looking for that when we do our wet into wet test. And speaking of going way back to using a lot of paper, I am going to be using a fresh sheet of Blick block bound cotton rag watercolor paper for this. So again, thank you to my awesome patrons for their help and their support. So I'm applying a wash of clean water. This is going to allow our paints to really diffuse into it. And you want to be careful because these paints are sticky, like they'll glob up onto your brush. So there's good dispersion into the water and the colors blend fairly readily and they move quite a bit. Granulation is a bit more noticeable, which is good. Because the paint globs on the brush, color control can be challenging, so you're probably going to want to work with a mixing palette for these. our wet into wet test has dried, I'm not seeing anything overly concerning, although the colors themselves are a little bit, just some of the pinks. Some of the pinks and some of the greens kind of concern me a little. This one here, this here. That would be the Pthalo Green, and I think it might be the Rose Red. That would be kind of understandable if they went dye for that. The rest of them are pretty good. I even see some granulation, some really nice misty effects, and I'm not seeing any of those halos, or at least not like really distinct white halos that you see with brands that use really optical brightener heavy, like the Arteza review. You could really see those halos. I'm seeing a little bit of white here and there. That could be the white of the paper though, but nothing that prevents the colors from mingling or mixing with one another. I'm also not seeing like a lot of harsh scaling. Now this blowback here, that's from there being an excess amount of water in those areas, so I'm not really concerned about that. So all in all, the wet into wet test promises that these might actually be pretty dang good for 13 bucks, which is amazing, because I think that might make these some of the cheap. Now we also should include shipping, so $6 shipping, that makes it a little bit under 20 maybe. So, you know, if you're ordering from the same shop, you may be able to save on shipping, but it still puts it in the price range of some of the cheapest student grade watercolors we've reviewed, right there with Cool Bank, while also performing a lot better than some of the cheapest watercolors we've reviewed. We've been talking a lot about other Shanghai Owin watercolor products without necessarily providing a lot of examples. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys some of the paints. I'm going to stitch in, I'm going to edit in some time-lapse snippets from their full reviews. If you're interested, I highly recommend you check those out. They'll be linked in the cards as well as in the description below, along with my full show notes. So that could be a great place to check. And that's basically gonna be what we're going to do. So I am going to start with the most comparable of these, which would be the other Aowen palette. Now I want to go ahead and let you guys know I do have the Meiliang Pigments palette somewhere. I brought it to a class that I was teaching, and I'm sure I brought it home, but now I can't find it. So I am going to stitch that in, but I'm not going to show it. So this is the other, they change how they spell the name every other time. So this is A-O-W-E-N. This is O and Win. That could just be different levels of quality. It could be different levels of branding. I'm not really sure because the listings aren't very clear. Has the same logo, manufactured by the same manufacturer. This set is pretty dang similar to the Meiliang Pigment set. The only difference is, to me, that I could find, were that these are poured pans. They're not really half pans, they're like these weird square pans, rather than being like extruded little smaller than half pans. So these are more like traditional half pans than what we saw in the Meiliang Pigment set, but both of them are good. Both of them are worth using. It really kind of boils down to personal preference and where you can get it and how much you feel like paying for it. The colors are even basically the same colors. So this is a 36 color set. This is a 24 color set. This set is available in 18 and 24. These are more like makeup pans of watercolor in terms of like, I assume they're really very shallow because they're in a, like this is meant to make it look deep, but they're on a riser that ends, I would say, right about here. So I imagine there's like a makeup pan's worth of depth. And if you kind of look in there, you can kind of see it. Am I going to disassemble this palette so that you guys can see it? Not until after the field test, if I do a field test. And I'm actually thinking about doing a field test because these are very similar to these, but they're different enough that I think they probably have different working properties. I've got an ongoing theory that these are meant to be more like Gensai. And Paul Rubens makes a Gensai-esque palette that I have not reviewed for you guys yet. The Frugal Crafter has. It's been in and out of my cart ever since I first saw it. And I just can't, it's got a lot of metallics in it, and that's why I kind of can't pull the trigger. Is I don't use metallics as much as some artists do because I work for reproduction. Speaking of, I'm just going to be ADHD all over the place. If you're new here, hi, welcome, I'm Becca. I'm a watercolor comic artist and illustrator. So when I'm reviewing watercolors, it's through the lens of watercolor comics. I'm not a fine art watercolorist. I'm not a card maker. I am just a comic artist who loves watercolors. So when I'm reviewing watercolors, I'm either looking at it as, will this work for my comics, 7-inch Kara, which you guys can read for free at 7inchkara.com, or will this work for my students? Is this something I could recommend to my students? Is this something I could see them using? So if it doesn't fit into either categories, I'm probably not going to be able to give it a very good review. But this set is pretty interesting. It's different enough from this that I feel like this deserves its own review, field test. This set I don't think I'm going to field test because it is so similar to the Meiliang pigment set that I think it's pretty safe to say they're going to handle basically the same way. I am going to hold on to it though, because it is nice to have watercolors that I'm familiar with that I can use in classes and allow my students to use or allow friends to borrow. So I'm going to hold on to this set. But I would say the Meiliang Pigments field test is probably going to work for this too. So I would say these are very similar. This set is around $20, so a little bit more expensive than this O.Win set. This is an all metal tin. It's available in cute colors. This set is available in green or red in both 18 and 24. That is also cute. I really like when art supply companies actually use some color in their packaging. These don't seem like they could be easily refilled because of just the weird format. And I really don't think you can buy the replacement chiclets for this. For this set, these could be very easily cleaned out and refilled. I mean, they're modular. You can change the color order as much as you want. You can't do that with this palette. And you could refill these with Paul Rubens paints if you want to. I have not seen these refills available for sale. That doesn't mean they're not. It just means I haven't seen them available in the US yet. As Paul Rubens and Shanghai Owin becomes more ubiquitous and more popular in the US, that could very easily change. So I'm not going to mark it against it yet, but it's something I'm going to be looking out for. Now, Paul Rubens is kind of the more professional grade version that Shanghai Owin creates. And this is one of their pocket palettes that I reviewed for you guys, and I really liked it. This thing is very makeup-esque, and that's not a bad thing, but you guys will probably see some similarities between these two sets. So with these were poured into like little bitty metal eyeshadow palettes and then put into this. And I mean, I say eyeshadow palettes, they might not have originally been for eyeshadow, but it's very similar to what's used in the makeup industry. So very similar to this, where it's really thin, shallow plastic pans. These don't really need any pre-activation. These have dried out quite a bit, but they are very receptive to water. You just go in with a wet brush. Basically, you don't need to spritz it. These, same thing. This is meant for travel. These are 24 colors all crammed into this tiny little palette, which is, you know, when Artist Loft wants to brag about how portable their palette is, this is portability. But very similar color palettes, almost even similar color layouts. I think this one has a few different colors. Like I know it has Mars Yellow in here, and this one doesn't have Mars Yellow, and this one has more neutrals than this set does. But in general, pretty dang similar. And honestly, this is around $24. So if you already know you like watercolor and you're looking for a good compact travel set that's ready to go, I would say just spend the extra money, get a beautiful watercolor set. But this is really small and it is difficult to not pollute the surrounding colors. You could also probably quite comfortably refill this from Paul Rubens tube watercolors, which I've also reviewed here on the channel. So I do have the swatch card for this handy. So this is what these colors look like. As you guys can see with Paul Rubens and Shanghai Owin, bright, saturated, vibrant colors is kind of their reason for existing, kind of what they do. I have reviewed some of their super granulating colors and found those to be really fun as well. They do also offer metallics. I don't see as many pastels from this line as I do with other student grade. Pastels are usually a really easy way to cheaply produce some watercolors because you can basically use one of the cheapest pigments, PW6, and just add a little bit of color to it and call it a pastel. Not to disparage all pastels. I do find pastels to be quite fun, and I do have some as kind of specialty watercolors that I like to use, but it's something I've definitely noticed with cheaper brands as a way to kind of extend what they're offering. Here's the regular Paul Rubens half pans. These saw some Art Supply redemption recently. So between this and the pocket palette, it really kind of depends on your use case and what colors you like, because both sets have different colors. They do offer several different sets. I don't intend on reviewing every set they offer. That would be incredibly expensive. Here is the swatch card. So you can see what I mean when I say Aowen usually includes a swatch card. This palette, I think, also has a swatch card, so it's unusual, and the Meiliang Pigments has a swatch card, so it's unusual that this one didn't come with a swatch card. Not a deal breaker, just a little weird. Maybe it's an older model. You guys will have to let me know if you've got the skinny down in the comments. So this is their regular half pans. These are extruded half pans. I have pointed out in the past the difference between extruded versus poured, or liquid poured, or hand poured. Honestly, there isn't, it really depends on how you paint, will determine which ones you prefer. With extruded paints like this, I do find pre-activation, not with this set actually, this set doesn't really benefit from pre-activation, but generally I find pre-activating them, letting them sit so that they're ready when you're ready to paint is beneficial. I just find them to be a little drier and a little more scrubby, but I find poured watercolors to sometimes get a little soapy, a little gluey, a little soupy if you add too much water. So it really just kind of depends on how you paint and how you like to handle your materials. This set, off the top of my head, this had a pack in with that large quill brush you guys saw me using, and I think this set is around $40. So this is a 24 color set similar to this. They probably have, let me move this. These two probably have very similar color ranges. Actually, I think this set has more blues and fewer purples than this set. So it kind of just depends on what you're looking for. This is already like kind of sticky and tacky. This has had a long time to dry. I actually prefer their tube watercolors over their half pan watercolors just because I like the color selection of their tube watercolors. I find their tube watercolors to be really delightful. And in general, Paul Rubens is quite economically priced for the quality that you're getting, which is one of the reasons I recommend them so frequently. And then finally, the Mozart Como Rebby set is another watercolor set. You guys can see I've used the heck out of this. It's another set that comes to mind when I'm thinking about comparable to this, but this set is more similar to a Gensai style watercolor. So this set is great for Edagami watercolor if you're into Edagami watercolor. It's very similar to the Kuretake Gensai Tambi set, just in terms of how the paints handle and what you can do with them. But I really like this set, and I find it to be a very flexible set. As you guys can see, I've used up almost this whole pan. I wonder if Mozart offers refills. They're white labeling this from someone else, and I don't, it could even be that Paul Rubens student grade set just rebranded, now that I'm thinking about it, because a friend of mine who bought the Paul Rubens set said that they were very similar. That would be good to know, because I really like this set. I enjoy painting with it. I find it quick, easy, responsive. I like the price point, but I'd love to be able to refill some of these colors, and if I knew, you know, who their vendor was, that would allow me to refill them. But I find these two sets to be pretty similar, not just in terms of color. Oh look, this one also comes with a color chart, but just in terms of handling and how they kind of remind me of one another. Now this set has a really strong kind of chemical smell to it. It can be a little bit off-putting. I think that's the binder that they're using. This set here didn't have any kind of, and that's something worth noting, because often when I'm reviewing cheap Chinese watercolors from AliExpress, they often have kind of like a funny smell to them, or like a nauseating smell, I've found. But the Paul Rubens sets overall, and when I say Paul Rubens, I mean the Shanghai Owin sets, overall don't. So if you're very sensitive to strong smells, this could be, I'm gonna do the sniff test, I'm gonna be super gross. Yeah, no, I don't really smell anything, which is good. So that could be an option for people who have like strong sensitivities to smells. So these are, and I'm going to include the Meiliang, even though you guys can't see it. I may also throw in the Paul Rubens Tubins, even though I didn't grab them for you guys. And I'll include the field test when applicable, just because I find these very comparable, and it'll help you guys hopefully be able to compare them for yourselves and be able to decide which one is best for you. Without having done the field test, I can't yet definitively say a whole lot about this other than what we've talked about. It has a lot of potential, but it could also have a lot of shortcomings that we're only going to find out if we put it through its paces. But right now, I would say it's very promising, especially at that price point. And I'll see if I can dig up an Amazon link for those of you who don't feel comfortable shopping through AliExpress. I buy through AliExpress all the time. I'm pretty careful with who I'm buying from. And I do tend to stick to the same vendors over and over again, but I haven't gotten burnt yet. So that's not to say there isn't a possibility, but I do think if you're buying Chinese specific brands like Shanghai Owin or Supervision, you're less likely to get burnt because it's less likely to be a knockoff. So this is the Meiliang Pigments palette. It is manufactured by Shanghai Owin. So all the palettes we're going to be talking about right now are manufactured by the same manufacturer. They're just different flavors of kind of the same thing. So I was really impressed and surprised by this palette. Normally this palette retails for around $20 on Amazon. It is a 36 color palette. It's got a great color selection, and it performs way above its pay grade. This is the student grade palette that kind of changed my mind about the potential for student grade watercolors, and it kind of inspired me to do the whole student grade Showdown, because I figured if there was one like this, surely there had to be more like this. My only problem with this palette, as you guys will see in a second, maybe, is that the paints themselves don't come in half pans. They come in this weird flimsy plastic liner that it just doesn't really lend itself to reusability. That's it. That's my downside for this palette, but this is the palette that I bring when I'm teaching watercolors to students to let them play around with, because it's just such a great introduction to inexpensive watercolors that punch way above their pay grade. If I were going to recommend one watercolor palette to somebody who's kind of interested in watercolors but is on the fence and doesn't want to spend a lot of money, it would probably be the Meiliang Pigments palette. As you guys can see from the field test, it delivers beautiful saturated color. It's able to do techniques that I would expect from much more expensive professional grade watercolors, and you get a pretty wide array of colors. So this is the Paul Rubens half pan palette. This one recently saw some art supply redemption, and these come in half pans, but Paul Rubens paints are available in a variety of formats, from tubes to that cute little pocket palette that I don't think I showed here, which is, it's because I did this video as a twofer, so I did both these half pans and the pocket palette, but I'd really recommend you check that video out as well. And it did indeed see some redemption, but I do still prefer the tubes over the half pans. After doing these re-swatches, I realized that they actually have different color palettes. They've included different colors in the different sets, and I just happen to like the color palette of the tube set I have over the half pan set. The tube set is just more, and actually it's pretty similar in colors to the Meiliang Pigments set, so it's just colors I happen to like better. But Paul Rubens half pan watercolors, I'm able to mix some beautiful saturated secondary colors. This is the Aowen watercolor palette, so it is really, really similar to the Meiliang Pigments. The only difference really is in the branding, in the color, in the name, and also in the fact that these actually come in their own half pans rather than in that weird cheap plastic liner. So if you're looking for an inexpensive student grade set that can kind of grow with your skill ability and you can refill with your own professional paints, I would recommend the Aowen over the Meiliang. But phonetically, Aowen and O.Win sound very similar, so I apologize if it gets kind of confusing. I'm going to call it the yellow palette set. But I really couldn't find a lot of differences between this yellow palette set and our original Meiliang Pigment set, so I think they're just two flavors of the same thing. All that said, I do think the O.Win, the red palette that we're looking at today, is distinct enough from these other palettes, just in the way the paints are manufactured, that it's worth field testing and worth taking a look at on its own. What are the pros and cons of this O.Win palette? Let's go ahead and start with the pros. This is a pretty cheap palette off of AliExpress, around $13 to $14, not including shipping. It's also very easy to use. The colors are very readily activated. You don't have to scrub. You don't have to struggle with them. They're also easy to mix. You can get some really nice color mixes out of these, although they did kind of struggle with the optical mixing, but that might be an ID10T error on my part, so we'll see. They have good saturation and they're quick to activate. There's even some granulation, which when it's come to these student grade watercolors, that's starting to become pretty rare. So it's kind of exciting to see it. And just in general, there are very few standout issues. What about the cons? It doesn't really seem like you get a lot of paint in this palette. So if you enjoy this palette, that might be a short-lived affair. You also can't easily refill just by the nature of how the palette is designed. You have these plastic pans that are kind of sunken. Ooh, sorry. That's going to lead to another one of the cons. But you have these plastic pans that are kind of sunken into the palette. So it's just not as natural to refill it. And I haven't seen the half pans for sale either. You also can't easily reorder the paints if you happen to have a preference for how you like your paints laid out, which is pretty common with other palettes, with the exception of the Meiliang Pigments palette. Can't really do that with that either. The plastic mixing surface up here at the top also stains very quickly, which might not be a big deal for some, but it might be a big deal for others. These don't really lift a whole lot, so if you make a mistake and you want to scrub it out, you're probably not going to be able to do that. And as you guys saw, these stay sticky for a long time after drying. Now, they are inset enough that you can just shut your palette and they shouldn't just goop all over the place and they shouldn't goop on one another. So that could be a pro, and that is actually something that the Paul Rubens travel set doesn't offer, because if you shut that thing when it's still wet, those paints are going to get on the lid. So that's something you don't have to worry about here. And it didn't come with a swatch card, which isn't the biggest problem, but all the other Shanghai Owin products that I've reviewed seem to have come with a swatch card, so it's just a little bit weird. It did come in the original packaging, which is a big step up from the Aowen palette that I reviewed for you guys earlier. So what's my verdict on the red O.Win 24 watercolor palette? This is a decent palette with some unusual properties that make it worth investigating further. It's fairly similar to the Aowen and Meiliang palettes, which isn't surprising as they all come from the same parent company. Slightly smaller color selection, it maxes out at 24, the Aowen seems to max out at 36, and Meiliang at 48. The palette is made of plastic and is fairly compact and lightweight, with a ring on the back for plain air painting. It also doesn't like snap shut the most securely, so you may want to rubber band or tape it shut if you are going to bring it out into the field or travel with it. I have a feeling that this is really meant to be a Gensai or a children's set, but let me know if y'all know. I'll probably field test this set to see how it differs from the Meiliang pigment set, so until then, I can't give you guys a definitive answer on which to buy, but hopefully you'll stay tuned to this channel, click the subscribe button, and hit that bell notification. So what do you guys think about this O.Win palette? Is it different enough from some of the other Shanghai Owin products to make it worth trying out for yourselves? Or are you gonna stick around and wait for the field test to see if this palette is right for you? I think it's promising, particularly at that price point. And I'm excited to try and dig a little bit deeper and hopefully find out a little bit more information about this palette that I can share with you guys in the field test. So if you are new here, make sure you click that subscribe button and that bell notification to let YouTube know that you want to see the field test for this video. And if you're interested in checking out more of my art, it would really mean a lot to me if you head on over to 7inchcara.com. There'll be a link down in the description below, and read my webcomic. It's totally free. If you enjoy it, You can always order copies through the Netto shop at nettosoup.com/shop. And if you can't afford to do that, a library request form, which costs you nothing, helps me out a lot because it lets your local library know that there are people interested in reading this book, and then they'll order it from me. So those are some easy ways to help out the channel. Speaking of helping out the channel, this video would not have been possible without the support and encouragement of my amazing patrons on Patreon. Thank you guys so much for everything that you do. I hope you guys enjoyed this. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Hopefully today's review will go towards helping you make art a habit. And if you're interested in learning how to watercolor, I've got a great watercolor crash course that I think you guys should check out. It's free here on YouTube, although of course my art nerds did get it and the supplemental materials first. So have a wonderful day, guys. Bye.